It happens in the blink of an eye. A screech of tires, a dull thud, and the sound of a bike frame crumpling against chrome. Zara doesn't even have time to gasp before the asphalt rushes up to meet her. The last thing she sees before the world tilts into darkness is a man stepping out of a sleek, black sedan. Kang Jun-hyuk. Late 40s, eyes like cold flint. Tattoos coil up his neck like dark ivy, disappearing beneath the collar of an expensive coat, inked remnants of a life soaked in blood and power, a past he buried but never truly escaped. He doesn't flinch at the sight of blood pooling beneath the broken bike. He doesn't look away from the unconscious girl. He looks at his driver, ignoring a ringing phone that carries $1 billion merger, and gives the order that shatters his future: forget the deal. The hospital is closer. Move. Later, in a hallway smelling of bleach and silence, Zara is a ghost. No ID. No phone. Just an 18-year-old girl who spent her life fixing her own problems and asking for nothing. Kang is not the kind of man who stops for strangers. He built an empire on silence and survived because he knew exactly when to walk away. His tattoos are older than most of his regrets, marks of a man who was supposed to be clean by morning. He tells himself to leave. He tells himself he's done his part. But then, a nurse hands him a small plastic bag of Zara's belongings. Inside, resting against a torn jacket, is a glowing gold locket. It catches the harsh fluorescent light, and Kang's heart stops. He recognizes the engraving. He recognizes the weight. He remembers buying it 19 years ago in a small shop tucked into a rainy street. He remembers the way Danielle laughed when he fastened it around her neck, the way she said it was too beautiful, too precious for someone like her. He remembers the night she vanished without a word. Jun-hyuk's fingers tremble as he opens the locket. Inside are 2 tiny photographs. One is Danielle, young, smiling, her eyes full of a warmth he hasn't seen in anyone since. The other photograph steals the air from his lungs. It is him. Younger. Softer. Standing beside her in a moment he barely remembers but will never forget again. For a long moment, the memory and the present collide in silence. Then understanding hits him, not like a thought, but like an impact, sudden and brutal, knocking the breath from his chest. The girl in that ICU room. The stranger he carried through the rain. The life he almost drove past without looking back. She isn't a stranger. She is his daughter. And for the first time in years, Kang Jun-hyuk feels something far more dangerous than fear or anger. He feels the past reaching for him. And this time, there is no walking away. Don't skip the next minute, because the secret Danielle was hiding is about to put a target on Zara's back. Like this video and comment revealed if you want to see what happens when the Mafia's enemies find out she exists. Before we continue, I'm curious, where in the world are you listening from right now? Tell me in the comments your country. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Your support keeps the story alive. Let's begin. The city of Seoul had a way of swallowing people whole, its neon veins pulsing with an indifference that only the truly lonely or the truly powerful could appreciate. For Zara Cole, the city was a series of concrete obstacles and steep hills, a labyrinth she navigated every day on a bicycle that had seen better years but never a better mechanic. The bike was an old, heavy-framed thing, painted a faded blue that matched the twilight sky just before the stars tried to compete with the skyscrapers. She had spent the better part of her afternoon tucked away in a small alleyway, her fingers stained with the dark, oily blood of a slipped chain and a stubborn derailleur. She didn't mind the grease. In fact, she wore it like a badge of honor. It was proof that she didn't need anyone to rescue her. At 18, Zara had learned that waiting for help was just a slower way of failing. She lived by a simple rhythm: fix what's broken, keep moving, and never look back long enough for the shadows to catch up. Her mother, Danielle, had taught her that, though the why behind it had always been buried in a shallow grave of secrets. As Zara pedaled toward the intersection that night, the air felt thick, heavy with the promise of a downpour that hadn't quite decided to fall. The humidity clung to her skin, and she could feel the vibration of the city through the handlebars. She was careful, she was always careful, checking her blind spots and keeping her pace steady. She wasn't looking for trouble, and she certainly wasn't looking for a miracle. She just wanted to get home, wash the grease from under her fingernails, and tell her mother that the bike was finally running silent again. But the universe has a cruel sense of timing, and sometimes, the silence you work so hard to achieve is shattered by the scream of tires on wet asphalt. A few blocks away, tucked into the plush, climate-controlled silence of a black sedan, Kang Jun-hyuk was having a very different kind of evening. To the world at large, he was a ghost, a myth carved out of steel and silence. To the men who worked under him, he was the quiet authority, a man whose neck tattoos, rising from his collar like inked warnings of a violent past, were the only things louder than his voice. He sat in the back seat, his face illuminated by the cold blue light of a tablet. On the screen was a merger, a massive, billion-dollar deal that would transition his family's interests from the dark corners of the underworld into the gleaming boardrooms of the corporate elite. It was supposed to be his clean break. For years, he had been moving pieces on a chessboard that spanned continents, trying to wash the blood from a legacy he never asked for but had inherited with a grim efficiency. The board members are already at the hotel, Chairman, his driver, Minho, said quietly. Minho was a man who had seen Kang at his worst, a man who remembered when the tattoos were fresh and the blood on Kang's hands wasn't metaphorical. They're expecting a signature by 8. This is the final step. After tonight, the old ties are severed. Kang didn't look up. He watched the rain begin to streak across the window, distorting the neon lights of the city into long, jagged smears of color. Nothing is ever truly severed, Minho, he replied, his voice a low vibration that seemed to settle in the very frame of the car. We just learned to hide the scars under more expensive suits. He was looking for redemption, or perhaps just a way to stop looking over his shoulder. He was 48 years old, and he was tired. He had spent his life building a fortress of power, only to realize that a fortress is just a fancy name for a cage. He was thinking of a woman he had lost 19 years ago, a woman whose name he hadn't spoken aloud in nearly 2 decades but whose memory was the only thing that kept him human in the dark. Danielle. She had been his light, and when she vanished, she took the sun with her. He told himself this deal was for her, a way to make the world she had lived in just a little less dangerous, even if she wasn't there to see it. The accident didn't happen with a roar, it happened with a dull, sickening thud that vibrated through the floorboards of the heavy car. One moment, Kang was lost in the ghost of a memory, and the next, the world tilted. The screech of tires followed, a late, desperate attempt to defy physics. Minho slammed on the brakes, the seatbelt biting into Kang's shoulder as the car skidded on the damp pavement. Silence rushed back into the street, heavier than before. Chairman, Minho breathed, his hands gripping the steering wheel so hard the leather groaned. She came out of nowhere. The bike, it just. Kang was already moving. He didn't wait for Minho to open the door. He stepped out into the humid night, the first drops of rain landing on his dark suit like tiny, cold bullets. He didn't look at the dent in his fender or the shattered headlight. His eyes were locked on the crumpled frame of a blue bicycle and the girl lying several feet away. She was so small against the vastness of the intersection. She lay in a heap, one leg twisted at an angle that made Kang's stomach tighten. Her jacket was torn, and her face was partially obscured by a mess of dark curls and the shadow of the streetlights. Kang walked toward her, his pace measured but his heart doing something it hadn't done in years, it was racing. He stood over her, his long shadow falling across her still form. He was a man who had seen death in 100 different ways, a man who had delivered it himself more times than he cared to remember. But this was different. This wasn't a soldier in a war or a rival in a dark alley. This was a girl who looked like she belonged to the daylight, now broken on the altar of his transition to a clean life. Chairman, the police, we should call, Minho started, stepping out of the car, his phone already in his hand. No, Kang said. The word was a blade, cutting through the air. He knelt beside the girl, his knees hitting the wet asphalt. He didn't care about the suit. He didn't care about the grease that was now smearing onto his palms as he gently brushed a lock of hair from her forehead. He saw a bandage on her temple, an old one, from some previous mishap, and a smear of bike grease on her cheek. She looked independent. She looked like a fighter. Even unconscious, there was a stubborn set to her jaw that felt hauntingly familiar. Chairman, the merger, Minho pressed, his voice tight with panic. The board. If we aren't there in 20 minutes, the deal collapses. They'll think you're being intercepted. The old families will see it as a sign of weakness. We have to move. Let the driver of the trailing car handle this. We have to go. Kang Junhyuk looked at the girl. He felt the heat of her skin, the shallow, ragged rhythm of her breath. He looked at her hands, small and calloused, the fingernails stained with the same grease that marked his own expensive sleeves. In that moment, the billion-dollar merger, the clean future, the corporate legacy, it all felt like ash. He saw a girl who had no one there to catch her, a girl who had been fixing her own bike in a city that didn't care if she lived or died. He remembered a night 19 years ago when he had made the smart choice, the calculated choice, and it had cost him everything that mattered. He wasn't going to do it again. The hospital is 3 blocks away, Kang said, his voice rising with a command that brooked no argument. He slid one arm under the girl's knees and the other behind her back, lifting her with a grace that belied his size. She was light, too light, as if she had been running on nothing but sheer will. Chairman, you can't be serious, Minho stammered, following him as Kang carried her toward the back door of the sedan. If you show up at a public hospital with a girl you just hit, the press, the optics, it will ruin everything. Kang paused, his hand on the door handle. He looked back at Minho, and for a second, the quiet authority returned, a cold, predatory light in his eyes that made the driver flinch. I spent 20 years building an empire so I wouldn't have to care about optics, Minho. If the deal collapses because I chose a life over a signature, then it wasn't a deal worth having. He settled the girl into the leather seat, her head resting against his chest. He could feel the faint beat of her heart, a fragile, ticking clock. He didn't know her name. He didn't know where she came from. But as he sat there in the back of the car, the rain finally beginning to pour in earnest, he felt a strange, terrifying sense of purpose. Go, Kang ordered. And Minho? Yes, Chairman? Drive like the devil is chasing us. Because if she doesn't wake up, he will be. The car roared to life, the tires spinning for a second before catching and propelling them forward. Behind them, the blue bicycle lay abandoned in the middle of the road, its front wheel spinning slowly in the wind, a lonely sentinel for a life that had just been split in two. Inside the car, the cold blue light of the tablet still glowed, notifications for missed calls and urgent messages from board members piling up like digital debris. Kang Junhyuk didn't look at them. He looked at the girl. He watched the way the streetlights flashed across her face, rhythmic and hypnotic. He reached out, his hand hovering over hers, before he finally pulled back. He wasn't a man who offered comfort, he was a man who offered protection. And as the car swerved through the rain-slicked streets toward the emergency room, the man who had built his power on silence found himself praying for a sound, any sound, from the girl in his arms. They reached the hospital in record time, the black car skidding to a halt at the ambulance bay. Kang didn't wait for the orderlies. He carried her in himself, his tattoos visible as his jacket fell open, his presence commanding the immediate attention of the triage nurses. She was in an accident, Kang told the head nurse, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. Head trauma, possible internal injuries. Her name? I don't know her name. Just save her. Everything else, the bills, the specialists, it's handled. Do you understand? Everything. The nurse nodded, taken aback by the intensity of the man standing before her. She looked like she wanted to ask questions, to demand a police report, but one look at Kang's face told her that those questions would have to wait. They moved her onto a gurney, and as the wheels clattered against the linoleum floor, Kang felt a sudden, sharp void in his arms. He stood in the center of the intake area, his suit soaked, his hands stained with rain and grease. Minho stood by the sliding glass doors, his phone still vibrating in his pocket. The deal is dead, Chairman, Minho said, his voice soft, almost mourning. The deadline passed 5 minutes ago. The executive board has left the hotel. Kang Junhyuk didn't respond. He didn't even turn around. He was watching the doors where they had taken the girl. He was a man who had just lost $1 billion, a man who had just jeopardized 2 decades of work. But for the first time in 19 years, he didn't feel like a ghost. He felt like he had finally stopped running. He walked over to the small desk where a nurse was sorting through the meager belongings they had taken from the girl's pockets before moving her to imaging. There wasn't much. A few coins, a tattered bus pass, and a small, clear plastic bag containing a single item that had fallen from her neck when they moved her. The nurse looked up at him. "Sir, you can't be back here." "I'm leaving," Kong said, his eyes fixed on the plastic bag. I want to make sure she has her things." The nurse sighed, her expression softening. "It's just this. No ID, no phone. She's a Jane Doe for now." Kong looked at the bag. Inside was a gold locket, its surface scratched but its presence unmistakable. Even through the plastic, it seemed to catch the harsh light of the hospital, glowing with a warmth that felt like a punch to the gut. Kong Junhyuk's world tilted. He knew that locket. He knew the weight of it. He knew the secret engraving on the inside of the back cover, a date and a set of initials he had traced with his own thumb 1,000 times in his dreams. He had bought that locket 19 years ago. He had placed it around the neck of a woman named Danielle Cole and told her it was a promise that he would always find his way back to her. Seconds later, as the silence of the hospital hallway pressed in on him, the truth shattered the last of his composure. The girl on the operating table wasn't just a stranger he had saved. She was the reason he had been trying to get clean all along. She was his. His knees didn't buckle, but his soul did. He reached out, his hand trembling as he touched the plastic bag. The quiet authority was gone, replaced by a man who realized that the metal meeting metal on that dark road hadn't been an accident at all. It was a collision of 2 worlds that should never have been apart. "Chairman?" Minho asked, stepping closer, sensing the shift in the air. "What is it?" Kong Junhyuk didn't answer. He couldn't. He just gripped the bag, the gold locket digging into his palm, and for the first time in his life, the man who had everything realized just how much he had to lose. The impact was over, but the fallout was only just beginning. He turned back toward the surgery doors, his jaw set, his eyes burning with a new, dangerous light. He had spent his life ending things. Now, he was going to fight for the only thing he ever wanted to keep. "Cancel everything," Kong whispered, though there was no one left to cancel with. "Find out who was tracking her. Find out why she was on that road." "And Minho?" "Yes, Chairman?" "Call the old guard. If anyone so much as breathes in her direction, I want them erased." The transformation was complete. The businessman was gone. The father had arrived. And as the rain hammered against the hospital windows, Kong Junhyuk prepared to turn the city red to keep his daughter's world clean. The hospital corridor stretched out before Kong Junhyuk like a long, sterilized throat, swallowing the sound of his footsteps. The air here was different from the world he inhabited. It smelled of sharp alcohol and the slow, heavy scent of fading hope. In his world, things were decided with a glance or a whispered word in a dimly lit room, but here, life was measured in the rhythmic beep of monitors and the frantic scratching of pens on clipboards. He stood outside the heavy double doors of the surgical wing, his back against the cool, painted cinder block, staring at the small plastic bag in his hand as if it held a live grenade. Inside, the gold locket shifted with a soft, metallic clink. It was a sound that shouldn't have been able to penetrate the thick silence of the hallway, yet it roared in his ears like a landslide. He moved toward a row of orange plastic chairs, sitting down with the stiff, mechanical movements of a man whose body had forgotten how to rest. He didn't look at Minho, who was pacing near the elevators, still checking his watch and answering muted calls from the board members who were now undoubtedly screaming for Junhyuk's head. The billion-dollar merger was a corpse now, cold and abandoned in a hotel ballroom across the city. Junhyuk didn't care. He reached into the bag and pulled the locket out, letting the chain drape over his calloused fingers. The metal was cold, but the memory it carried was white-hot. He remembered the day he had bought it. It had been a humid afternoon in the Gold District, a place where people went to turn their sweat into something permanent. He had walked in with his sleeves rolled up, his neck tattoos still fresh and angry, looking like exactly what he was, a rising enforcer for a family that didn't believe in mercy. The jeweler had trembled, but Junhyuk hadn't been there for a tribute. He had been there for a gift. He had chosen the heaviest gold, a piece that felt substantial, as if its weight could anchor Danielle to him in a world that was constantly trying to tear them apart. He had paid in cash and walked out into the rain, feeling a strange, terrifying warmth in his pocket. With a thumb that had pulled triggers and broken bones, he now gently pried the locket open. It resisted for a moment, the hinge stiff from years of being worn against a heart, before it gave way. Inside, the engraving was still clear, protected from the elements by the seal of the metal. *K and D. Always * and below it, the date. The night they had stood on the roof of a crumbling apartment building, looking out over a Seoul that seemed too big and too cruel for two people who only had each other. A shadow fell over him, and he didn't need to look up to know it was Minho. The driver's presence was a tether to the reality he was supposed to be leading, the reality of power, mergers, and mafia politics. "Chairman," Minho said, his voice hesitant, hushed by the gravity he sensed radiating from his boss. The nurse came out. "They've moved her to a recovery room. She's stable, but she hasn't woken up. They're calling her Jane Doe. They need to file a report with the authorities since there's no identification." Junhyuk closed his eyes, his grip tightening on the locket until the metal bit into his palm. "Her name isn't Jane Doe," he whispered. His voice was a rasp, the sound of a man who had spent a lifetime holding his breath. "Her name is Zara." Minho paused, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Zara? Sir, how could you possibly know?" Junhyuk opened his hand, revealing the locket. "I gave this to her mother 19 years ago. The night I thought I lost her. The night I was told she was dead." The realization hit Minho like a physical blow. He knew the stories. Every man in the organization knew the legend of the woman who had humanized the quiet authority and then vanished, leaving behind a man who was more shadow than soul. Minho looked toward the recovery room doors, then back at the girl's bicycle grease still staining Junhyuk's expensive suit. "If she's Danielle's daughter," Minho started, the weight of the implication hanging in the air. "She's mine," Junhyuk finished. The words felt like an admission of guilt and a declaration of war all at once. For 19 years, he had lived as a man without a future, a man whose only goal was to turn his blood-soaked past into a clean, corporate legacy so he could die in a bed rather than a gutter. He had thought he was doing it for his own redemption. Now he realized he had been building a kingdom for a ghost, never knowing that the ghost had a pulse. He stood up, the orange chair scraping against the floor. "I need to see her. Now." "Sir, the doctors, they said family only." "I am the only family she has," Junhyuk growled, walking past Minho with a renewed, predatory focus. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't wait for a nurse to guide him. He followed the instinct that had kept him alive in the underworld, the ability to find the most important thing in a room full of distractions. He found her in room 412. It was a small, cramped space that felt too sterile for the vibrant, independent girl he had seen on the road. Zara lay in the bed, her skin a deep, beautiful contrast to the pale hospital sheets. A bandage was taped to her forehead, and a thin tube ran into her arm, delivering the fluids her body needed to recover from the impact. Her eyes were closed, her lashes long and dark against her cheeks. In the quiet of the room, Junhyuk could see the details he had missed in the rain. She had Danielle's nose, that slight, elegant curve. But the jaw, the stubborn, defiant line of it, that was his. He pulled a chair to the bedside, moving as quietly as he could, as if he were afraid that his very presence might shatter her. He was a man of violence, a man of iron and ink, and sitting in this room felt like a sacrilege. He looked at his hands, the knuckles scarred, and felt a sudden, sharp wave of shame. How could he be her father? How could a man who had spent his life destroying families be the one to claim this girl? He thought of Danielle. He had met her in a club where she was singing, her voice the only thing that could cut through the noise of his life. They had lived in a fever dream for 6 months, a mafia enforcer and a girl with a voice like honey. He had tried to hide her, tried to keep her in the daylight while he moved through the dark. But the shadows always find a way in. He had been sent on a mission that had gone wrong, a betrayal from within his own family. When he had returned, bloodied and broken, he was told she had been caught in the crossfire. He was told she was gone. He had spent 2 decades believing that lie. He had buried his grief under a mountain of power, becoming the man everyone feared because he had nothing left to lose. And all that time, she had been out there. She had been raising his daughter in the very city he ruled, hiding in plain sight. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the sleeping girl. The words felt small and inadequate, lost in the hum of the air conditioner. "I'm so sorry I wasn't there to fix the bike." He reached out, his hand hovering over hers. He wanted to touch her, to feel the heat of her skin and convince himself that she was real, but he was afraid. He was afraid that if he touched her, she would wake up and see the tattoos on his neck, see the monster that had hit her with his car, and know exactly who he was. He was a man who lived in the dark, and she was a girl of the daylight. The collision on the road was a metaphor for their entire existence. A soft knock at the door broke his trance. It was the nurse, carrying a clipboard. She looked at Jun Hyuk, her expression a mix of professional caution and genuine curiosity. "The patient is Zara," she corrected herself, seeing the way Jun Hyuk's eyes never left the girl. "Her vitals are strong. The concussion is mild, but she has some deep bruising. She should wake up within the hour. We've processed the insurance information you provided. It's quite extensive, sir." "She is to have the best of everything," Jun Hyuk said without looking back. "I want a private guard at the door. Not hospital security. My own." The nurse hesitated. "Sir, this is a hospital, not a fortress." Jun Hyuk finally turned his head, his cold, flinty gaze locking onto hers. "In this city, they are often the same thing. My daughter is staying here until she is ready to leave. No one enters this room without my permission. No one." The nurse nodded quickly, intimidated by the sheer gravity of his voice, and scurried out. Jun Hyuk turned back to Zara. The word daughter still felt strange in his mouth, like a new language he was trying to learn. It carried a weight that no merger or business deal could ever match. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He began to talk to her, his voice a low, melodic vibration. He didn't know if she could hear him, but he needed to say the words. He told her about the locket. He told her about the night he bought it, and the woman he had given it to. He told her about the city she lived in, the one he had built and broken and was now trying to fix. He told her that he was a man of many regrets, but that finding her on that road was the only thing in his life that felt like it wasn't a mistake. "You're like her," he said, his voice softening. "Independent. Careful. You fix your own problems. I saw your bike, Zara. You did a good job on the chain. But you shouldn't have to do it alone anymore. Not anymore." He thought of Danielle again. Where was she? Why had she fled? The locket proved she had kept the memory of him alive, yet she had kept Zara hidden. Was she afraid of him? Or was she afraid of the world he represented? He knew the answer before he even finished the thought. He was the most dangerous man in Seoul. Any connection to him was a death sentence. Danielle hadn't been hiding Zara from him, she had been hiding Zara from his enemies. And now, by hitting her with his car and bringing her to this hospital under his name, he had blown that cover into 1,000 pieces. Panic, a cold and unfamiliar feeling, surged through his chest. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the rainy street below. He saw the black sedans of his own men stationed at the entrances, but he also saw the shadows of the city. He knew how this world worked. Word would travel. The quiet authority had abandoned a billion-dollar merger for a nameless girl. People would ask why. They would dig. They would find the connection. He wasn't just her father, he was her greatest threat. He turned back to the bed, watching the rhythmic rise and fall of her chest. He had a choice. He could leave now, pay the bills anonymously, and disappear back into the shadows, letting her believe he was just a guilty businessman who had done the right thing. He could let her go back to her life of fixing bikes and living in the daylight. But then he looked at the locket on the bedside table. Always, he couldn't leave her. Not again. He had spent 19 years as a ghost, and he wasn't going to let his daughter be one too. If the world was going to come for her because of him, then he would simply have to destroy the world first. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years, a number that belonged to the old guard, the men who didn't care about mergers or corporate images, the men who only understood loyalty and blood. "It's Kong," he said when the line picked up. "I need a full sweep of the Cole residence. Danielle Cole. Find her, protect her, and bring her to the hospital. And find out who has been watching them. If there's even a hint of a tail, erase it." He hung up and looked at Zara. He could feel the shift in the room, the way the air seemed to thicken with the impending storm. He was no longer a man trying to be clean. He was a man who realized that sometimes, to protect the light, you have to become the darkest thing in the room. He sat back down and reached for her hand. This time, he didn't hesitate. He wrapped his large, scarred fingers around her small, calloused ones. Her skin was warm, a vital, pulsing reality that grounded him. "Wake up, Zara," he whispered. "Wake up so I can tell you who you are." As if in response, her fingers twitched. It was a small movement, a tiny spark of life, but it sent a jolt through Jun Hyuk that nearly brought him to his knees. He watched her face, his heart hammering against his ribs. Her curls shifted against the pillow, and a small, pained groan escaped her lips. Her eyelids fluttered, struggling against the weight of the anesthesia and the trauma. Jun Hyuk held his breath, the world outside the room fading into nothingness. There was only this, the girl, the locket, and the truth that was about to change everything. Zara's eyes opened. They were bloodshot and unfocused at first, wandering across the sterile white ceiling before finally settling on the man sitting beside her. She looked at him for a long time, her mind cloudy and slow. She saw the dark suit, the tattoos rising from his collar like inked warnings, and the intense, haunted look in his eyes. She didn't scream. She didn't pull away. She just looked at him with a quiet, observant intensity that made his breath catch. "You," she rasped, her voice thin and dry. "The car." "I'm here," Jun Hyuk said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're safe. I promise you, Zara, you're safe." She frowned slightly, the name sounding strange to her in his voice. She looked down at their joined hands, then at the locket resting on the table. Her eyes widened, a flash of recognition breaking through the haze. She looked back at him, her gaze searching his face, looking for the man Danielle had described in stories that always ended too soon. "How do you have that?" she whispered, pointing at the locket. Jun Hyuk picked it up, the gold gleaming in the light. He held it out to her, his hand steady even as his world trembled. "I gave this to your mother a long time ago," he said. "I've been looking for it for 19 years. I just didn't know I was looking for you, too." Zara stared at him, the silence in the room growing until it felt like it might burst. The identity gap was closing, the truth rushing in to fill the void. She wasn't just a girl on a bike anymore. She was the daughter of the most dangerous man in the city. And as she looked into his eyes, she saw the inked warnings for what they truly were, a map of the life he had lived to get back to her. The locket's secret was out. The fracture was complete. And in the quiet of room 412, the Korean Mafia boss and the girl from the road began the long, dangerous journey of becoming a family. Jun Hyuk knew the war was coming, but as he held his daughter's hand, he knew he finally had something worth winning for. He leaned back in the chair, the weight of the locket in his pocket and the weight of his legacy on his shoulders, and waited for the daylight to break. The rain had transitioned from a violent downpour into a persistent, haunting mist that clung to the windows of the hospital, blurring the neon lights of Seoul into ghostly smears of violet and gold. Inside room 412, the air was thick with the weight of decades-old secrets. Zara had fallen back into a light, fitful sleep, her hand still twitching occasionally as if she were reaching for the bicycle handlebars that were no longer there. Kong Jun Hyuk stood by her bed for a moment longer, the gold locket now tucked safely into the inner pocket of his suit, resting directly over his heart. He felt a phantom warmth emanating from the metal, a compass needle finally pointing toward the north he had lost 20 years ago. He stepped out into the hallway, where the clinical white light seemed to sharpen the edges of his resolve. Minho was waiting, his face pale and drawn. He held a tablet that was now buzzing with a different kind of urgency. The corporate merger was dead, but a new, more dangerous machinery had been set in motion. "We found the address, Chairman," Minho whispered, his voice echoing slightly in the empty corridor. "It's a small apartment in a district that doesn't show up on the luxury maps. It's quiet, tucked behind a seafood market. No security cameras, no high-profile neighbors. Just the kind of place where a ghost would go to stay dead." Junhyuk didn't hesitate. "Stay here. Double the guard. If Zara wakes up and asks for me, tell her I've gone to bring her mother home." The drive to the outskirts of the city was silent. Junhyuk watched the landscape change from the gleaming glass towers of his corporate ambition to the weathered, crowded brick buildings of a neighborhood that lived on the margins. This was the world Danielle had chosen, a world of anonymity and survival, a world where the name Kang Junhyuk carried no weight because no one dared to speak it. They pulled up to a narrow building draped in a tangle of power lines and rusted fire escapes. The scent of salt and old wood hung heavy in the air. Junhyuk stepped out of the car, his expensive leather shoes clicking against the uneven pavement. He looked up at a third-story window where a single, dim yellow light was burning. He could feel his pulse in his throat, a rhythmic pounding that felt like a countdown. For 19 years, he had lived with the absolute certainty that Danielle Cole was a memory. Now, every step up the narrow, creaking staircase felt like he was walking through time itself. He reached the door of apartment 3B. It was a simple wooden door, the paint peeling at the edges, a small plastic chime hanging from the handle. He raised his hand to knock, but his fingers hovered an inch from the wood. "What do you say to the woman you loved when you spent 2 decades believing she was ash? How do you explain that your own shadow was the reason she had to hide?" He knocked. 3 soft, deliberate raps. A moment of silence followed, then the muffled sound of footsteps. A lock turned, then another. The door opened just a few inches, held by a safety chain. A woman's face appeared in the gap, partially obscured by the shadow of the hallway. She looked tired, her eyes searching the gloom with a practiced suspicion. But when her gaze landed on the man standing in front of her, on the dark suit, the calm eyes, and the tattoos rising from his collar, the air seemed to leave the room. "Junhyuk?" The name was a broken whisper, a sound she hadn't permitted herself to make for nearly 20 years. "Danielle," he said. His voice was thick, anchored by a grief that was suddenly, miraculously, transforming into something else. The chain rattled as she fumbled with it, her hands shaking so violently she nearly dropped the latch. When the door finally swung wide, Junhyuk saw her fully. She had aged, the fine lines around her eyes telling the story of a life lived in the trenches of worry, but she was still the woman from the roof. She was still the honey-voiced singer who had made a mafia enforcer believe in the sun. She didn't move toward him, and neither did he. They stood in the threshold of her small, humble living room, a space filled with the scent of lavender and old books, and the undeniable presence of Zara's life, a discarded jacket on a chair, a sketch of a bicycle gear on the table. "You're alive," she breathed, her hand covering her mouth. "They told me, they showed me the news, the explosion at the docks. They said there was nothing left. I was supposed to be dead," Junhyuk said, stepping into the room as she moved back, her legs hitting the edge of a small sofa. "And I was told the same about you. I was told the fire at the club took everyone. I spent 19 years building a fortress to hide the fact that I was already empty inside." Danielle sank onto the sofa, her face pale. "I saw you on the news sometimes over the years. A new CEO, a clean businessman. But I knew the ink on your skin. I knew that the world you lived in never lets go. I couldn't come back, Junhyuk. I wanted to, every single day, I wanted to run to you. But I had her." "Zara," he said, the name sounding like a prayer. Danielle looked up, her eyes widening in a sudden, sharp panic. "How do you know her name? Why are you here, Junhyuk? If you found us, then they can find us. You shouldn't have come." I didn't find you through a ledger or an informant, Danielle, he said, sitting on the edge of a wooden chair opposite her. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the locket, holding it out in the palm of his hand. The gold shimmered in the dim lamplight. She was in an accident. My car hit her bike. I carried her to the hospital myself, not knowing who she was until this fell out of her pocket. Danielle gasped, her hands flying to her throat where the chain used to rest. Is she okay? Tell me she's okay. She's stable. She's sleeping. I have my best man at her door, he assured her. He watched the relief wash over her, followed immediately by a crushing weight of guilt. Why didn't you tell me, Danielle? Why did you let me believe I was alone? The silence that followed was heavy with the ghosts of the past. Danielle looked around her small apartment, at the life she had scraped together from nothing. Look at this place, Junhyuk. It's quiet. It's safe. Zara grew up without ever knowing the sound of a gunshot or the smell of a warehouse fire. She grew up believing her father was a good man who died young, a man who worked with his hands and loved her mother. I gave her a life in the daylight. She stood up, pacing the small rug, her voice rising with a desperate edge. If I had told you, she would have become a pawn. Your rivals would have used her to get to you. Your own family would have seen her as a weakness or a future threat. I saw what that world did to you, Junhyuk. I saw the way you looked when you came home with blood on your cuffs. I loved you, I never stopped loving you, but I couldn't let your shadow fall on her. I chose her over us. I had to keep her out of the shadows. Junhyuk looked down at his hands, at the scars and the ink. He thought of the billion-dollar merger he had just walked away from. He thought of the clean life he had been trying to manufacture. I've been trying to leave it behind, Danielle. Everything I've done for the last decade was to make the world safe enough that I wouldn't have to be a monster anymore. You can't wash away the ink, Junhyuk, she said softly, sitting back down and finally reaching out to touch his hand. Her skin was warm, a familiar comfort that made his chest ache. The shadows don't care about mergers or boardrooms. They only care about blood. I know, he said, his grip tightening on hers. And that's why I'm here. By hitting her on that road, I've already brought the shadows to her door. My name is on her hospital chart. My men are in the lobby. The secret you kept for 18 years is gone. Danielle's eyes filled with tears, a single drop tracing a path down her cheek. Then she's in danger because of me. Because I kept that locket. I should have thrown it away. I should have buried it. No, Junhyuk said firmly. She's in danger because of who I am. But she's safe because of who I'm going to become for her. I spent my life destroying things to build power. Now, I'm going to use that power to end the ghosts once and for all. I'm not going to let you hide anymore, Danielle. And I'm not going to let her be a ghost. He stood up, pulling her with him. The reunion wasn't the cinematic explosion of joy he might have dreamed of in his darkest hours. It was a somber, heavy realization of time lost and a war gained. But as Danielle leaned her head against his chest, her breath hitching as she finally allowed herself to lean on someone else, Junhyuk felt the last of the quiet authority melt away. He was a father. He was a partner. Come with me, he whispered into her hair. She's going to wake up soon. She needs to see both of us. She needs to know that the daylight isn't a lie. Danielle looked at the small apartment one last time, the sanctuary she had built with fear and love. She realized that the time for hiding was over. The shadow of the Korean Mafia boss had finally caught up to them, but for the first time, she saw that the shadow was also a shield. Okay, she said, her voice regaining a hint of the song he remembered. Take us home, Junhyuk. As they walked down the creaking stairs and out into the misty night, the black sedan was waiting, its engine humming like a beast in the dark. Junhyuk opened the door for her, his hand resting on the small of her back. He looked up at the moon, partially obscured by the Seoul smog, and felt a grim, soaring sense of purpose. The ghost of Danielle was gone, replaced by the woman he would burn the city down to protect. The journey back to the hospital was the beginning of a new chapter, one where the shadows would finally have to learn to fear the light. The hospital room was a symphony of low-frequency hums and the distant, rhythmic squeak of rubber soles on linoleum, but to Zara, it felt like a battlefield where the smoke was finally clearing. She drifted in and out of a shallow, medicated sleep, her mind snagging on fragments of memory, the screech of tires, the smell of rain, and the weight of a gold locket that felt heavier than the bike she had spent her life maintaining. When her eyes finally opened and stayed open, the harsh fluorescent glare of the ceiling seemed to have softened. The shadows in the corner of the room weren't just shadows anymore, they were people. Kang Junhyuk sat in the same orange plastic chair, his dark suit now rumpled, his presence a heavy, grounding force that seemed to anchor the room. Beside him stood a woman whose silhouette was so familiar it made Zara's heart ache with a sudden, sharp clarity. It was Danielle. Her mother looked different, the constant, vigilant tension that had defined her for 18 years had been replaced by a raw, exposed vulnerability. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her hands twisting a damp tissue into a small, white knot. "Mom?" Zara's voice was a dry rasp, barely more than a whisper. Danielle was at her side in an instant, her cool hand pressing against Zara's cheek. "I'm here, baby. I'm right here. Don't try to move too fast. The doctor said you need to rest." Zara's gaze drifted past her mother to the man standing just a few feet away. Junhyuk didn't move toward her. He stood with his hands clasped in front of him, a posture of respect and restraint that felt alien on a man with inked warnings climbing his throat. The gold locket sat on the bedside table, its lid flipped open like an accusing eye. "He was the one," Zara said, her memory sharpening. "In the car. He brought me here." She looked back at her mother, her brow furrowed in a confusion that was rapidly curdling into suspicion. "How do you know him, Mom? Why is he looking at us like he's seen a ghost?" Danielle's breath hitched, a small, broken sound that seemed to signal the collapse of an 18-year-old dam. She looked at Junhyuk, a silent plea for help that he answered by stepping forward into the light. "Zara," Junhyuk said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to settle in the marrow of her bones. "My name is Kang Junhyuk. 19 years ago, I was a man who lived in the dark. I loved your mother with everything I had, but the life I led, it didn't allow for things like light or family. I was told she was gone. I was told the fire took her." Zara's head spun. She looked at the locket on the table, the initials K and D, and then back at the man. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but the image they formed was a nightmare she didn't know how to wake up from. "You told me he was a mechanic," Zara said, her voice rising, cracking with a sudden, jagged edge of anger. She turned her eyes toward Danielle, who flinched as if struck. "You told me he died in an accident when I was a baby. You told me we were alone because the world was just unlucky. You lied to me. Every day for 18 years, you looked me in the eye and lied. I was protecting you, Zara." Danielle cried, the tears finally spilling over. "I saw what his world did. I saw men in suits who looked like him come to our door with blood on their hands. I saw the way he looked when he came home after a job. When the fire happened at the club, I realized it was my only chance. If I stayed, you would have been born into a cage. If I died, you could be free. I didn't give you a father, but I gave you a life where you didn't have to look under the car for a bomb every morning. So you gave me a ghost instead?" Zara pushed herself up, ignoring the throbbing pain in her temple and the protest of the 4-line in her arm. "You let me grow up wondering why we were always moving, why you were always looking over your shoulder. You let me believe I was the daughter of a ghost while the man who actually gave me life was running this city." She turned her gaze to Junhyuk, her eyes blazing with a fierce, independent fire that made the mafia boss pull back an inch. "And you? You're the quiet authority. I've heard the names. I've seen the news. You built an empire on people's fear. And you hit me with your car because you were too busy sealing a clean deal to notice a girl on a bike." Junhyuk bowed his head, a gesture of profound humility that would have shocked his board of directors. "I have no excuses, Zara. I spent 19 years as a dead man walking because I thought the best part of me had perished in that fire. I tried to make the world clean for a memory. I didn't know I had a daughter to fight for. If I had known you were out there, I would have burned the city to the ground to find you. That's exactly the problem. Zara shouted, her voice echoing in the sterile room. You talk about burning things and inked warnings and power. I don't want an empire. I don't want a mafia boss for a father. I wanted the mechanic you told me about, Mom. I wanted the life that wasn't a lie. The fracture was complete. The three of them stood in the small hospital room, a triad of broken truths and shattered identities. To Zara, her mother was no longer the simple, hard-working woman who stayed in the kitchen, she was a fugitive who had stolen half of Zara's history. And the man before her wasn't a savior, he was a catalyst for a chaos she wasn't sure she could survive. Danielle reached out to touch Zara's hand, but Zara pulled away, her movements sharp and pained. Don't. Not right now. Zara, please, Danielle whispered. He's trying to change. He's closing it all down. He did it for us. He did it for a memory, Zara corrected, her voice turning cold and distant. He didn't do it for me. He didn't even know I existed until he ran me over. Jun-hyuk stepped closer, his shadow falling over the bed. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook, the one he had carried since the day he took over the family. He placed it on the table next to the locket. In there are the names of everyone who ever looked for you, Jun-hyuk said quietly. In there are the records of every deal I've made to ensure that when I finally stepped into the light, there would be no one left to follow me. I didn't know your name, Zara. But everything I built was an altar to the woman who gave you life. You are the only clean thing I have ever touched. Zara looked at the notebook, then at the locket, and finally at her father's face. She saw the inked warnings on his neck and realized they weren't just marks of violence, they were scars of a man who had been at war with himself for 2 decades. The life we had is over, isn't it? Zara asked, her voice small, the anger replaced by a crushing realization. We can't go back to the apartment. We can't go back to the bike. Danielle shook her head, her face buried in her hands. The moment he brought you here, the secret was out. The shadows know you now, Zara. Jun-hyuk's jaw set, the mafia boss returning to the surface, but this time, he was a protector. The shadows know you, he agreed, his voice a low, dangerous promise. But they also know me. And they know that I will destroy anything that moves toward you. Zara sank back into the pillows, the weight of her new identity pressing down on her chest. She was no longer just Zara Cole, the girl who fixed her own bike. She was the daughter of Kang Jun-hyuk. She was a target. She was a legacy. She looked at her mother, then at the father she was told was dead, and realized that her life had indeed split in two. The fracture was deep, jagged, and permanent. Get out, Zara said softly, her eyes closing. Both of you. I need to think. I need to figure out who I am when the lie is gone. Danielle began to protest, but Jun-hyuk placed a hand on her shoulder, shaking his head. He understood the need for a quiet mind. He had spent 19 years in one. We'll be right outside, Jun-hyuk said. I've stationed guards at every entrance. You're safe, Zara. For the first time in your life, you are truly safe. As the door clicked shut behind them, Zara opened her eyes and looked at the gold locket. It was a beautiful thing, glowing in the dark, but it felt like a shackle. She reached out and touched the initials K and D, her fingers tracing the metal. She didn't know if she could ever forgive her mother, and she didn't know if she could ever love the man who had hit her with his car. But as the rain continued to hammer against the window, she knew one thing for certain, the daylight was coming, and she was going to have to learn how to walk in it, even if her father's shadow followed her every step of the way. The fluorescent hum of the hospital had become a physical weight, a persistent vibration that Zara felt in the marrow of her bones until she couldn't breathe. Every time the heavy door to her room creaked, she expected a new lie to walk in, or perhaps a ghost from the shadows her mother had spent 18 years describing. She waited until the deep, velvet hours of the night, when the shifts changed and the hallway guards, the men with the sharp suits and cold eyes, were at their most rhythmic and predictable. She didn't need a bicycle to be fast. She moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who had spent her life navigating the margins, slipping out of the side exit and into the cool, damp air of the Seoul night. She didn't go home. Home was a crime scene of broken trust, a place where the scent of her mother's lavender now smelled like wood smoke and deception. Instead, Zara walked until her lungs burned and the bandage on her temple throbbed in time with her heartbeat. She sought the only place that had ever belonged to her, the abandoned concrete span of the Mapo Bridge's lower maintenance walkway. It was a place of rusted iron and the constant, low-frequency roar of the river below. Here, the city's neon lights were distant and distorted, and the air smelled of wet stone and oil. It was a place for things that were broken but still standing. Zara climbed the rusted ladder and sat on the edge of the girder, her legs dangling over the dark, churning water of the Han River. She squeezed the gold locket in her palm until the metal edges left a jagged imprint on her skin. She felt fractured, split between the girl who fixed her own bike and the daughter of a man who could command the city to stop. She didn't hear him approach. Kang Junhyuk didn't move like a man of his size, he moved like the shadows he inhabited. He didn't call out to her, nor did he rush to pull her away from the edge. He simply stepped onto the walkway, his expensive leather shoes silent on the metal, and stood 10 feet away. He had discarded his suit jacket, his white shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal the full extent of the tattoos on his forearms, dragons and waves that seemed to move in the dim light. "I used to come to places like this when I was your age," Junhyuk said, his voice barely rising above the roar of the water. "When the world felt too loud, or when I had done something that made me want to jump into the dark just to see if the river was cleaner than I was." Zara didn't look back. "How did you find me?" "I made sure to take the back alleys. I didn't think your guards were that good." "They aren't," he admitted, stepping closer but keeping a respectful distance. "But I know how you think, Zara. You don't run toward people when you're hurt. You run toward the things you can understand. You run toward the steel and the grease. You run toward the things that don't lie." Zara finally turned her head, her eyes red-rimmed but fierce. "Everything is a lie. My name, my father, the reason we moved every 6 months. My mother told me you were a mechanic. She told me you were a good man." "I was never a good man," Junhyuk said, his voice devoid of self-pity. It was a cold statement of fact. "But I wanted to be. For her. And now, for you." "I didn't know you existed, Zara. If I had, I would have walked away from the dark 20 years ago. I would have let them take everything I had just to hold you once." "But you didn't walk away," she countered, gesturing toward the city skyline that glowed like a crown of thorns behind him. "You built this. You're the quiet authority. You're the reason people are afraid to walk in the daylight. And now, because of you, I have to be afraid too. My mother said the shadows know me now. Is that true? Am I just a target now?" Junhyuk walked to the edge and leaned against the railing, looking out at the water. The moonlight caught the silver in his hair and the deep, haunted lines around his eyes. "The shadows know you," he said quietly. "But they only know you because they are looking at me. They think you are my weakness. They think you are a vulnerability they can use to stop the merger, to stop the transition, to keep me in the dirt where they think I belong." He turned to face her, and for the first time, Zara saw the man beneath the legend. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had spent 19 years building a fortress only to realize he had built it on top of a grave. "I made a choice tonight, Zara. In that hospital room, when I saw you open your eyes, I realized that the clean deal I was chasing, the mergers, the boardrooms, the polished suits, it was all just another lie. I was trying to paint over the rust without fixing the frame. I was trying to keep the power while shedding the guilt." He stepped toward her, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a heavy, silver-encased signet ring, the symbol of his family's underworld authority. Without a word, he tossed it over the edge. It disappeared into the dark Han River with a tiny, insignificant splash. "What are you doing?" Zara whispered. "I'm ending it," Junhyuk said, his voice vibrating with a sudden, terrifying resolve. "All of it. The empire, the debts, the quiet authority. I'm not just transitioning, Zara. I'm dismantling. I'm going to burn the old world down until there is nothing left but ash. I will liquidate every asset, sever every tie, and erase every name that could ever pose a threat to you or your mother. You can't just quit, Zara said, her voice trembling. Men like you, they don't get to just walk away. They'll come for you. Let them come, Jin-hyuk replied, a dark, predatory smile touching his lips. They've spent 20 years fearing me because I had nothing to lose. Now they will fear me because I have everything to protect. I am going to make it clean, Zara. Truly clean. Not for the board members, and not for the press. For you. He knelt on the metal walkway so he was at eye level with her. He didn't try to touch her, but the intensity of his gaze was a physical weight. I can't give you back the 18 years of lies. I can't be the mechanic your mother told you about. But I can be the man who ensures you never have to look over your shoulder again. I will be the shield between you and the dark until there is no dark left. That is my vow. Under this bridge, by the blood we share, I will make it clean. Zara looked at him, searching his face for the quiet authority, but all she found was a father. The anger that had been fueling her for the last few hours began to ebb, replaced by a hollow, aching exhaustion. She looked at the locket in her hand, then at the man who had hit her with his car and then offered her the world. You're going to lose everything, she said softly. I lost everything 19 years ago, he reminded her. Everything I've done since then has been a rehearsal. Tonight is the real performance. I don't want the empire, Zara. I want to sit at a cafe with your mother and watch you ride your bike without wondering if the car behind you is a threat. I want to learn how to rest. Zara wiped a stray tear from her cheek, the salt stinging the small cut near her eye. She didn't forgive him, not yet, and she didn't know if she ever would. But as she looked at the tattoos on his neck, the inked warnings that he was now promising to turn into a fortress for her, she realized she couldn't run anymore. If you do this, Zara said, her voice steadying, if you burn it all down, what happens to us? We walk into the daylight, Jin-hyuk said. Together. He held out his hand, not as a command, but as an invitation. Zara looked at the scarred knuckles and the ink, then slowly, tentatively, she reached out and placed her hand in his. His grip was warm and solid, a promise in the dark. As they stood together on the abandoned bridge, the wind howling through the girders and the river rushing beneath them, the bridge vow was sealed. Kang Jin-hyuk, the man who had built a city on silence, had finally spoken the only truth that mattered. The war was coming, and the corporate world was about to see what happens when a mafia boss decides that his daughter's peace is worth more than $1 billion empire. Let's go home, Zara, he said. We have a lot of work to do. They walked back toward the city, two figures moving through the mist, one a man reclaiming his soul, the other a girl discovering her power. Behind them, the Mapo Bridge stood silent, a witness to the moment the shadows began to retreat. The fracture was still there, but for the first time, it didn't feel like a breaking point. It felt like a beginning. The transition from the shadows of the Mapo Bridge to the glass and steel canyons of Seoul's financial district was not merely a change in geography, it was a descent into a different kind of warfare. For Kang Jin-hyuk, the battlefields of his youth had been defined by cold steel and dark alleys, where an enemy's intent was as clear as the blade they carried. But in the climate-controlled corridors of Kang Industries, the weapons were ledgers, NDAs, and the poisonous drip of whispered rumors. As Jin-hyuk began the agonizing process of dismantling his criminal ties, a new predator emerged from the light, one who wore $1,000 silk tie and a smile that never reached his eyes. Park Sung-jae, the chief operating officer and a man Jin-hyuk had once trusted to be the clean face of the company, sat in his corner office overlooking the city. To the world, Park was a visionary executive, the architect of the billion-dollar merger that had just collapsed. To Jin-hyuk, he was now a shark sensing blood in the water. Park had spent years positioning himself to inherit the legitimate side of the empire, and the sudden appearance of an 18-year-old girl with a bicycle and a gold locket was a variable he had not accounted for. To Park, Zara Cole wasn't a daughter, she was a glitch in his meticulously programmed ascent. The sabotage began subtly, like a hairline fracture in a load-bearing wall. While Zara stayed hidden in a high-security safe house Jin-hyuk had established, a penthouse that felt more like a gilded cage, the foundation of Kang Industries began to groan. First, it was the logistics contracts. shipments of medical supplies and tech components, the very backbone of Jun Hyuk's legitimate transition, began to vanish in transit or were seized by anonymous customs tips. Then, the investors began to flee. Someone was leaking selective fragments of Jun Hyuk's past, carefully curated to make it look like the quiet authority was not leaving the mafia, but rather bringing the mafia into the boardroom. Jun Hyuk stood in his office, staring at a bank of monitors displaying the plummeting stock price. He felt the old rage simmering in his gut, the urge to find the source of the leak and silence it with the permanence he had once specialized in. But he had made a vow under the bridge. He had promised Zara he would make it clean. Every time he felt his hand twitch toward the drawer where he used to keep his silenced pistol, he remembered the way she had looked at him, the mix of fear and hope that he could actually be the man her mother had described. "He's targeting the logistics wing," Chairman Min-ho said, stepping into the office with a stack of audited reports. "Park Sung-jae has been meeting with the minority shareholders in private. He's telling them that your personal distractions, he means Zara, are making you a liability. He's calling for an emergency board meeting to vote on your removal." Jun Hyuk turned slowly, his eyes cold. "He thinks he can use my daughter to bait me back into the dark. He wants me to react like a thug so he can prove to the board that I haven't changed." "It's working," Min-ho admitted. "The shareholders are terrified. And there's more. Zara's safe house, someone tried to bypass the digital encryption on the security gates last night. They didn't get in, but they left a message. A physical one." Min-ho placed a small, transparent evidence bag on the desk. Inside was a charred remains of a bicycle tire. Jun Hyuk's jaw tightened so hard the muscles in his neck strained against the inked warnings of his tattoos. It was a direct threat. Park wasn't just trying to take the company, he was testing the boundaries of Jun Hyuk's newfound restraint. He was targeting Zara as the weak spot, a pressure point to see if the mafia boss would break his vow of nonviolence. Meanwhile, Zara was beginning to feel the walls of the penthouse closing in. She spent her days pacing the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the city where she had once been free. She missed the grease on her hands. She missed the anonymity of her old life. But more than that, she felt the invisible threads of the corporate war tightening around her. She found the anonymous messages on her laptop, ghostly pings that bypassed her father's firewalls. "Your father's past has a long reach," Zara, one read. Asterisk, "Do you really think a man with those tattoos can ever be clean? You are the anchor dragging him down." Asterisk. She didn't tell her father about the messages. She didn't want to see the quiet authority return to his eyes. But she began to do what she had always done, she began to fix things. Using the high-end workstation in the penthouse, Zara started digging into the very company that was supposed to be her inheritance. She didn't look at the polished PR reports, she looked at the raw data, the logistics logs, and the archived contracts. Her independent mind, the one that could find a fault in a complex derailleur by sound alone, began to find the patterns in the corporate sabotage. She found the discrepancies in the shipping manifests, small, repetitive errors that all led back to a shell company controlled by Park Sung-jae. He wasn't just sabotaging the company to oust her father, he was embezzling from the transition fund to build a war chest of his own. The tension reached its breaking point on a Tuesday afternoon, when the air in Seoul felt stagnant and heavy. Jun Hyuk received a call from Park. "Chairman," Park's voice was smooth, devoid of any obvious malice. "The board is meeting tomorrow. We've heard the rumors about your daughter. It's a shame, really. A girl like that, she deserves a father who isn't a target. If you step down now and hand over the remaining shares, I can ensure that the shadows you're so worried about go back to sleep. Think of it as a severance package for your conscience." Jun Hyuk held the phone, his knuckles white. He looked at a photo of Danielle and Zara that he had recently placed on his desk, the only clean thing in the room. "You're making a mistake, Sung-jae," Jun Hyuk said, his voice a low, terrifying vibration. "You think my daughter is my weakness. You think she's the anchor that stops me from moving. But you've forgotten why I'm called the quiet authority. I didn't build this empire because I was loud. I built it because I was thorough. The board won't care about thoroughness when they see the police reports I've filed regarding your unorthodox security measures," Park retorted. Goodbye, Junhyuk. Give my regards to the girl. I hope she likes the view from the penthouse. It's the last high ground you'll ever hold. The line went dead. Junhyuk stood in the silence of his office, the corporate shadow looming over everything he had tried to build. He realized that the battle for his soul wouldn't be won with a vow or a signature. It would be won by outmaneuvering a man who thought that clean meant weak. He walked to the window and looked toward the penthouse where Zara was. He didn't know that at that very moment, Zara was hitting send on an encrypted file to Minho, a file containing the digital proof of Park's embezzlement. She was no longer just the protected, she was becoming the protector. The stage was set for the final confrontation. The corporate shadow had tried to use Zara as a weapon against her father, but they had both underestimated the girl who fixed her own bike. The empire was crumbling, but as Junhyuk looked out at the city, he didn't see ruin. He saw the opportunity to finally burn away the rot. The war was no longer in the alleys, it was in the light of the boardroom, and for the first time in his life, Kang Junhyuk felt like he was playing with a deck that wasn't stacked against him. Minho, Junhyuk called out, his voice regaining the sharp, crystalline clarity of a commander. Prepare the car for tomorrow morning. And tell Zara to get her best suit ready. If Park wants a show, we're going to give him one he'll never forget. The fracture was still there, but as the corporate vultures circled, the mafia boss and his daughter were finally moving in sync. The shadows were deep, but the daylight was coming, and it was going to be blinding. The night air was a cold, damp blanket that smelled of diesel and the impending rain that always seemed to follow the Kong name. Zara sat on the edge of the plush, oversized sofa in the penthouse, the blue light of her laptop screen the only thing illuminating the room. She was deep into the digital architecture of Kong Industries, her fingers flying across the keys with the same rhythmic precision she used to use when tensioning bike spokes. But the silence of the high-rise was deceptive. It wasn't the peaceful silence of her old apartment, it was the heavy, pressurized silence of a submarine under thousands of feet of water. She could feel the corporate shadow moving in the dark, a presence that didn't need to break a window to make itself felt. The notification sound was small, a sharp ping that made her jump. It wasn't an email or a work message. It was a video file, sent from an untraceable relay. Zara hesitated, her heart hammering against her ribs, before clicking play. The footage was grainy, taken from a distance. It showed the seafood market near her mother's old apartment. It showed Danielle walking to the store, her head down, her shoulders hunched in that familiar, defensive posture. Then, the camera zoomed in. A man in a gray suit, unmistakably one of Park Sung-jae's observers, was standing only a few feet behind her, holding a phone as if he were just checking the time. He looked at the camera and smiled. The screen went black, replaced by a single line of text, **: restraint is a luxury your father cannot afford. But you? You're just a girl who doesn't know how to stay in the light**. Zara closed the laptop, her breath coming in shallow, jagged gasps. She looked at the door, where two of her father's guards stood like statues. They were supposed to be her shield, but she realized then that they were also a beacon. By staying hidden, by letting her father make it clean on his own, she was leaving the flank wide open. Park Sung-jae didn't want a boardroom brawl, he wanted to terrorize the one thing that made Kang Junhyuk hesitate. She stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the sprawling, neon labyrinth of Seoul. She saw the Mapo Bridge in the distance, a thin silver thread over the dark Han River. She thought about the vow her father had made there, to dismantle his empire for her. He was trying to become a better man, but in doing so, he was fighting with one hand tied behind his back. He was trying to play by the rules of a world that Park Sung-jae was currently rewriting. I can't just wait for the light, Zara whispered to the glass. She realized that her mother's strategy, 18 years of running, of changing names, of hiding in the shadows, had only worked as long as they were nobodies. Now, they were the center of a gravity well. If she kept running, she would only lead the shadows to more people she loved. She thought about her bike, abandoned on that rainy road. When a chain slips, you don't just keep pedaling and hope it catches, you get your hands greasy. You align the gears. You force the machine to work. A soft sound at the balcony door made her spin around. It was a scratch, rhythmic and deliberate. Zara approached the glass, her hand reaching for a heavy glass award on the side table, the only weapon she had. Outside, on the narrow ledge of the penthouse, stood a figure in a dark hoodie. For a terrifying second, she thought it was an assassin. But as the figure looked up, she saw the polished face of Park Sung-jae's personal assistant, a man she had seen in the background of her father's corporate briefings. He didn't try to enter. He held up a physical envelope against the glass, his eyes wide with a strange, frantic energy. He tapped the glass once and then disappeared into the shadows of the building's exterior maintenance track. Zara opened the door, the cold wind rushing into the climate-controlled room. She grabbed the envelope and retreated inside, her hands shaking. Inside were photos, not of Danielle, but of the boardroom. They showed the internal security logs of the embezzlement she had been tracking. But there was something else, a map of the logistics routes where the seizures were happening, and a handwritten note, *, he isn't just stealing. He's planting. The medical shipments contain more than just medicine. If the board sees what's in those crates tomorrow, your father goes to prison for life. He won't just be unclean, he'll be a ghost again, *. The threat was no longer just corporate, it was existential. Park was going to frame Jun-hyuk for the very crimes he was trying to leave behind. He was going to use the quiet authorities' reputation as the evidence. Zara felt a cold, crystalline calm settle over her. It was the same feeling she got when a repair was particularly difficult, when the solution required more than just strength, it required a perfect understanding of the mechanism. She couldn't run to her father with this. If she did, his instinct would be to protect her, to hide her further, perhaps even to revert to the quiet authority and commit a violence that would prove Park right. I have to be the one, Zara said, her voice steadying. She went back to the laptop. She didn't look for Park's embezzlement anymore. She looked for the leak. If Park was planting contraband in the shipments, there had to be a digital trail, a signature for the rerouted manifests, a timestamp for the warehouse overrides. She began to code, using the independent, self-taught skills she'd developed to bypass the restrictive firewalls of her childhood. She moved through the company's mainframe like a ghost, her independent mind finding the flaws that the high-priced security teams had missed. She found it. A hidden subdirectory in the logistics software, accessible only by a high-level override key, Park Sung-jae's key. It was all there, the schedules, the contents of the ghost crates, and the names of the corrupt customs officials Park was paying off. But as she began to download the files, the screen flickered. A red dialog box appeared in the center of the display, * access denied. Security Protocol 9 initiated *. No, Zara hissed, her fingers flying. The lights in the penthouse began to pulse, a slow, rhythmic red. The guards at the door turned, their radios crackling with static. Zara realized that by touching the files, she had tripped a silent alarm that Park had set as a trap for anyone, including her father, who tried to look too closely. The threat in the dark was no longer a whisper, it was a siren. She heard the heavy thud of boots in the hallway. It wasn't her father's men. The guards at her door were suddenly engaged in a muffled struggle, the sound of bodies hitting the wall echoing through the thin wood. Zara didn't panic. She didn't wait for a rescuer. She grabbed her laptop, her mother's locket, and the envelope, and headed for the service elevator she had mapped out days ago. She stepped into the dark, industrial lift just as the penthouse door was kicked open. As the elevator descended, Zara looked at her reflection in the scratched metal walls. Her face was pale, the bandage on her temple slightly frayed, but her eyes were different. The innocence the thumbnail had once captured was gone, replaced by a realization that was far more dangerous. She wasn't just his daughter. She was his partner in this war. She reached the basement garage, the smell of oil and cold concrete greeting her like an old friend. She found her father's car, the one he had been using to visit her. She didn't have the keys, but she knew the bypass for the electronic ignition of this specific model. She had studied it while she was trapped in the penthouse. Within seconds, the engine hummed to life. She drove out into the night, the neon lights of Seoul rushing past her like a blur of digital rain. She wasn't running away from the shadows. She was driving straight into the heart of the corporate shadow. She was going to the boardroom. She was going to show them that a girl who fixes her own bike knows exactly how to take a machine apart when it's built on a lie. The bridge vow had been her father's promise to her. Now, this was her promise to him. She would not let him be a monster for her sake. She would be the light that exposed the rot. As she pulled into the shadows across from the Korean Industries headquarters, she saw the black sedans of the board members beginning to arrive for the emergency session. She saw Park Sung-jae step out of his car, looking clean, polished, and utterly confident. He thought he had won. He thought the black girl was a weak spot. Zara gripped the steering wheel, the gold locket around her neck glowing with a faint, reflected light. "You think you know who I am," she whispered, her eyes locked on the executive. "But you've never seen me fix a machine." The threat was real, and the dark was deep, but Zara Cole was done hiding. She was moving from fracture to choice. And in the morning, when the city woke up, the quiet authority wouldn't be the only name they feared. They would know the daughter who refused to let the daylight be a lie. The glass doors of the Korean Industries executive floor didn't slide open, they parted like a curtain before a final act. The air in the corridor was refrigerated and sterile, smelling of expensive cologne and the electric hum of high-stakes machinery. At the end of the hall, the boardroom was a sanctuary of dark wood and silenced voices, where the future of an empire was being weighed on a scale of greed and fear. Inside, the atmosphere was funereal. Park Sung-jae sat at the head of the long mahogany table, his fingers steepled, looking every bit the savior the panicked board members had been praying for. He had spent the last hour meticulously dismantling Kang Jin-hyuk's reputation, laying out a trail of digital breadcrumbs that led straight to the ghost shipments he had planted. "It is a tragedy," Park said, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone. "But we cannot allow a man's personal ghosts to drag this company back into the gutter. Jin-hyuk has proven that he is a liability. For the sake of our shareholders, for the sake of our legacy, we must vote for his immediate removal." Jin-hyuk sat halfway down the table, his posture unnervingly still. He looked like a man made of stone, his eyes fixed on a point just above Park's head. He didn't defend himself. He didn't roar. He was a man waiting for a storm he knew he couldn't stop. He had made a vow to be clean, and in this room, his silence was being used as an admission of guilt. The board members, a dozen men and women in various states of agitation, began to murmur their agreement. The chairman of the board raised a hand to call for the vote. "Is there any further?" The heavy oak doors at the back of the room swung open. The sound was a sharp, percussive intrusion that made several executives jump. Framed in the doorway was a girl who looked like she had walked straight out of a street fight and into a palace. Zara Cole was wearing a suit that was a fraction too large, one she had scavenged from her father's penthouse wardrobe, and her temple was still marked by the frayed bandage of the accident. She looked small against the vastness of the boardroom, but her eyes held a crystalline, terrifying focus. "The vote is premature," Zara said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried the independent weight of someone who had spent her life relying on no one but herself. Park Sung-jae stood up, his face a mask of patronizing concern. "This is a private session, young lady. Security, please escort Miss." "I'm not a guest, and I'm not a distraction," Zara interrupted, walking toward the table with a stride that made the board members lean back. She didn't look at her father. She looked only at Park. "I'm the person who found the leak in your logistics manifest. And I'm the person who's going to show this board exactly what you've been doing with their transition funds." Jin-hyuk's head turned slowly, a flicker of shock crossing his face before it was replaced by a grim, soaring pride. He watched as his daughter, the girl who fixed her own bike, reached the center of the table and slammed a silver flash drive onto the mahogany. "You think my father is the liability?" Zara asked, looking around the room at the silent executives. "You think a man with tattoos on his neck can't be trusted? Then you should look at the man in the silk tie. Because while my father was trying to burn his old world down for the sake of this company, Park Sung-jae was rebuilding it in the shadows." She tapped a key on the central console. The massive projection screen at the end of the room flickered to life. It didn't show the grainy police reports Park had prepared. It showed the raw, encrypted logs Zara had pulled from the logistics mainframe. It showed the shell companies, the offshore accounts, and the digital signatures on the contraband manifests. The crates weren't my father's, Zara said, her finger pointing at a highlighted line of code. The override key used to authorize those shipments belongs to the COO's private terminal. It was logged at 2 a.m. 3 nights ago, the same time Mr. Park was supposedly at a charity dinner. The room erupted into a low, frantic buzzing. Park's face went from pale to a sickly, mottled gray. This is a fabrication. This girl is a common thief who broke into our servers. I didn't break in, Zara countered, her voice turning cold and sharp. I fixed the machine. I found the part that was grinding the gears and I removed it. She turned her gaze back to the board. Every shipment seized by customs in the last month was a setup designed to drive the stock price down so Mr. Park could execute a hostile takeover using embezzled funds. He wasn't saving the company. He was harvesting it. The evidence was undeniable. The logs were a map of a betrayal so thorough it left Park no room to move. He looked around the table, searching for an ally, but the board members were already turning away, their loyalty shifting to the side of the data. Jin-hyuk stood up then. He didn't need to speak. His presence was a heavy, atmospheric pressure that seemed to drain the air from the room. He walked to the head of the table, standing directly behind Park. The quiet authority was back, but it wasn't the violence they feared, it was the absolute, crushing weight of his judgment. You targeted my daughter, Jin-hyuk said, his voice a low, terrifying vibration that made the water in the glasses on the table tremble. You thought she was the weak spot in the frame. But you forgot that a machine is only as strong as its smallest part. And Zara? She's the part you couldn't break. Park Sung-jae looked at Zara, his eyes filled with a sudden, desperate hatred. You think you're ready for this? You think you're not like him? Zara didn't flinch. She stood her ground, her hand resting on the table near the gold locket she had placed there. I'm exactly like him where it counts, she said. I don't leave things broken. The chairman of the board cleared his throat, the sound like a gavel. Mr. Park, you are hereby stripped of your title and your shares, pending a full criminal investigation. Security will escort you to the lobby, where the authorities are already waiting. The silence that followed Park's exit was absolute. The board members looked at Jin-hyuk, then at Zara. They saw the inked warnings on the father and the fierce, independent fire in the daughter. They realized that the clean transition they had been promised wasn't going to be led by a man trying to hide his past. It was going to be led by a family that had survived it. The chair is empty, the board chairwoman said, looking at Zara with a sharp-eyed respect. And we are a company that has just realized it has been lying to itself for far too long. Jin-hyuk looked at the empty seat at the head of the table. Then he looked at Zara. He didn't take the seat himself. Instead, he pulled it out for her. It was a silent, profound gesture, a passing of the torch that made the bridge vow feel real. I'm dismantling the old world, Zara, Jin-hyuk said softly so only she could hear. But someone has to lead the new one. Someone who knows how to keep the daylight honest. Zara looked at the chair, then at the 12 people waiting for her to speak. She thought about the seafood market, the bike grease, and the mother who had run for 18 years. She realized she couldn't run anymore. She had to stay. She had to fight. She had to be the choice for the future. She sat down. The weight of the seat was immense, but for the first time since the accident, Zara Cole felt like her life wasn't split in two. She was the daughter of a mafia boss, and she was the architect of a new legacy. She was Zara, and she was the clean future. Let's begin, Zara said, her voice steady and undeniable. We have a lot of things to fix. The boardroom coup was complete. The executive was gone, the shadows were retreating, and the girl from the road had finally found where she belonged. Jin-hyuk stood behind her, his hand resting briefly on her shoulder, a shield that was no longer needed, but a father's pride that would never fade. The daylight had finally broken through, and it was blindingly, beautifully clean. Thank you so much for walking this journey with Zara and Kang Jin-hyuk today. This story is about second chances and the power of truth, and we are so grateful to have you as part of our community. Before you go, we'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments if you haven't already. And if this story moved you, please hit that like button and subscribe to join us for the next chapter of the legacy.